Associating your users with your API keys is essential. It makes it easier to track their usage and easier to reach out if there's ever an issue. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can associate your API keys from Unkey with your favorite authentication provider. In this example, it's Clerk, but you can use any authentication provider you'd like. So the first thing we want to do is create a new next.js application, and we'll call this one Unkey with Clerk. And we'll just let this all be the defaults. And then we need to install two packages here, the Clerk package and the Unkey API package. And those will allow us to do the entire work. And then just for styling, we'll use Tailwind and shadcn so that we have some way to display it to the user. So let's first do npm install @clerk next.js and Unkey API. And then we can do npx shadcn UI @latest init. And that should allow us to init the project. We're using TypeScript. We'll use the default. We'll use Slate. We'll use our global CSS there. And everything else is the defaults. And we're going to be using server components throughout this application. We will be using a client component as well, but we'll be using both. So now that we have that, we can open up a IDE. Now we have our IDE open. We need to create a .env here, and then we will fill these out. So first we need next public clerk publishable key. We also need clerk secret key. We also need Unkey API ID, and we also need Unkey root key. Okay, so we have all those. We'll just hit save for now and we'll go and get those in a second, but we can do some more application setup first and then come back to this. So first thing you want to do is wrap your layout here in the Clerk provider. So we can just do clerk import Clerk provider from @clerk/next.js, and we'll wrap our body in this. And that will give us access to Clerk. Then we also need to do middleware. So we can do a new file and put that at the root of our directory. Call it middleware.ts. And in here, we're actually going to use Clerk's defaults, but we'll grab that from the documentation so I don't have to write out the matcher, and we can go from there. So let's go and get keys. Let's go and get the matcher, and then let's do some more work. Okay, so first let's start with Unkey. So first thing, make sure that you're signed up for an account. So now that you have signed up for an account, you have your APIs here. If you go into your API ID is going to be in this top right-hand corner here. I'll just zoom in a bit more. It's going to be in this top right-hand corner. We'll take that one and then we'll drop that in our application here. So go to our env and add that to the API. Then we need a root key. So you go to settings here, go to root keys, create a new key, create the root key, and then copy that. Note that once you have this, we won't show it to you again, so you need to store it somewhere safe. So now we have a root key and we have our API key. Now we just need these two. So we can actually just go to dashboard.clerk.com, and I'll use my personal account and we'll create a new application here and we'll call it Unkey with Clerk. And we just leave those as the defaults, doesn't really matter, choose what you want. And then we'll just copy those, drop those in there and hit save. Now we need to go to our documentation from Clerk. So if I click continue in docs and we scroll down to this section right here and copy this, and we'll drop that right in this middleware file. So what this middleware file does is it protects your application. Essentially what it does is it sets everything to require auth in some nature. We will be coming back here and updating this in the future, but for now, all it's doing is any route that you go to, including API routes, will all be protected, which is perfect for our application. So now we have our basics of an application set up. What we want to do now is actually use shadcn to grab some of the components that they have available so that we can use those to essentially just show some information. So let's do that part now. So from your terminal, we're going to need to use the following command. So it's npx shadcn UI at latest, add button. We're going to add input, label, and card, and we'll just install those to our components right here. So now we have those, they're available to us. Now I can zoom out a bit more so that you guys can actually see the entire screen. So now at this point, we have our application, we have our Unkey API ID, we have a root key, we have the secret, we have the publisher key. We've also got clerk set up now. So now we actually need to create our client component that's just going to hold some information around Unkey, which is essentially just an input for a user to add a name to their API key, and then we're going to create the API key for them. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a component here in this section, and we can just call it, the file name here keys. And then inside of that, we're going to create a file called client.tsx, just so that we know that it's the client one. Then we need to use client at the top. Then we need to import basically all of this stuff that come from shadcn. So import button, and that's just going to come from @/components /UI/button. And then we just need to do that again for input. So we can do import input from, and we can just copy this basically and change the last part to input. And then we're also going to need the label. So if we just copy and paste this down as well, change this to label, and change the end to label as well. And then the final one is this card, and the card has multiple components inside of its original one. So I'm just going to copy and paste this from somewhere else just to make it a bit quicker, because it's not really about the UI, it's about the implementation. But essentially you want to import all of these things. Now, if you don't want to do the entire thing, you just want to see how this works, there is a link in the description for a GitHub repo that you can just check out and start using. So now we have all of that. Now we can actually create our component here. So we'll call it const unkey elements. And then inside of here, we can essentially just return. And then all we're going to return here is essentially just a card that the user can essentially just say, create API key. Underneath, it'll just say, this is where you create an API, give it a name. And then we'll take an input box, and then we'll use a server action to actually create the content. So the good thing about this is we're actually just going to copy this a few different times just to show off in this example. So we can do empty8 here. And then underneath that, we can use our card element here. We'll give it a class name, and we'll give it a width. So we'll say W is 350 pixels. And then inside of that card, we need a card header. So card header. And inside of that card header, we just need the card title. And inside of that card title, we'll just say create API key. So now we have that. Then underneath that, we need card description. And inside of that, we'll just say create your API key. And now we have the card description. Then underneath the header, inside the card still, we're going to create a form. And that form for right now is going to have the card content. And inside of that card content, all we're going to do here is just essentially ask them to give it a name, and then there'll be a button. So we just need to flex that out a little bit here. So we'll just do class name equals grid, width is full, items are center, and gap is 4. Then underneath that, we'll have another div, and inside that div, we'll have another class name here, and it will just be flex col, and then space y.15. All right, so now we have that. Inside of here, we can just add a label, and then the HTML4 is going to be name. And then we can say give your key a name. Then under that label, we're going to use an input. And that input is going to be name equals name. And placeholder, just write key for next project. Something simple. And there we go. Then just underneath our card content here, we're going to have card footer. And this is just going to have a button with a type of submit. And we'll just say create key. And then we'll just add a class name here as well. And we'll set that class name equal to flex, justify, between. And that's our card essentially done here. Then we just need to export this out. So we can just do export, Unkey elements, hit save. And now we can use this wherever we need to. So the next thing we want to do here is actually go to our page. So we can just go to app and then go to page here. And we can essentially remove everything that's here. So we'll just delete everything that's in here except from the main div here. We want that still. And then we're going to import the Unkey elements. So we put it in .. components keys client. So now we have this. And then inside of here, I'm just going to paste in a bit of fancy code, I guess, which is just a way to show that this is an auth provider. And then we have this Unkey elements that's available now. We can also delete this out and hit save. All right. So now we have a starting point. We have this Unkey elements. It has a card, but this form doesn't actually do anything. So if we just launch this application with npm run dev, we're going to sign in here. So let me just sign in with Google and I'll use my Unkey account. We'll get back to localhost. You see, we just have this key right now, but if we click this button, nothing happens. And you can see that up here, it's just a name and nothing happens. So we need to actually have a way for us to actually call our Unkey API to do this. So inside of our keys here, we're actually going to create a new folder and we're going to call it actions. And inside of that actions, we're going to create a new file. I'm going to call it create.typescript. Then we're going to use a server action to essentially create the keys. So you're going to use server at the top if you've never used the server action before. We're going to import auth. And that's going to come from clerk because we're going to use that to associate the key with the user. So we can do from @clerk/next.js. Then we also need to use Unkey. So we're going to do import Unkey from @Unkey/API. And then we can actually use this server action. So the way this works is it's just an async function. We call it create. We're going to take form data in. So form data, and that's going to be a type of form data. And then at this point, we can actually use this to call in and check to make sure everything works. So first thing we need to do is check to see if there's any auth here. So we can just do const user ID equals auth. So now we're checking to see if there's auth here. And quick fix on this type, it should be form data with capital F. Okay, now we can say if there's no user ID, return null. And for now, this is fine, but really you should probably handle that however you want. So then we're going to say const token equals, and then process.env unkey root key. And then we also need const API ID is equal to process.env.unkey API ID. And then let's just fix that spelling. And then again, if there's neither of these, so if there's no token or there's no API ID, we should also return null. So return null. And all we're doing here is making sure that you've actually set your application up correctly because you need both of these to be able to create a key. So now we know that we've got that. Now we need to get the name. And the name is coming, remember, from this original component here. As part of it, you're going to give the key your name. Now, this isn't the user's name. It's just a name to associate with the key. Then we can do form data.get. We'll get it as name. And we'll get that as a string. So essentially what we're saying here is this form.name is going to be a string. Otherwise, if they didn't enter it for whatever reason, we'll just put in my awesome API. So now we're basically at the endpoint now. Now we just need to create the key itself. So first thing we need to do is instantiate Unkey. So we can do const Unkey equals new Unkey. And then we're going to pass in token. So now we have this. Now we have the keys to the kingdom. So now we can do const key equals await unkey dot keys. So this dot keys. And then we want to create, so dot create. And then we're going to pass in some information here. So what we want is the name. That name. We want the owner ID. And the owner ID here is going to be the user's actual ID from Clerk. So user ID. And then finally the API ID. And then that satisfies our types here, or everything that is required to make this work. This is an optional field. This is also an optional field, but the API ID is required. Right. And then we can return the key.result. So that gives us a way to actually create this function now. So now we need to go back to our client component and actually use this. So what we can do now is go back to our client component here and actually import this at the top. So we can just do an import. Say import create from, and then it's just going to be ./actions/create. So now we have access to this. We also need to use useState as well. And this will all make sense in a second because we're actually just going to use useState to show the new key. So get that from React. Now we're ready to go. So the first thing we want to do is just say const key set key equals useState, and by default it'll be an empty string. Then we can say async function on create. So basically we're saying on create, pass in the form data. Then we're just going to use the create action here. So we can just say const await create, and we're just going to pass in the form data. So form data. And then if res set key to res.key.key. And we'll do an optional chain here. So now we have the onCreate, and we're just saying if there's a response, set the key to this. Otherwise, set it to this. This should never happen. It's just making TypeScript happy. We could technically tell it's never going to be null. But now we have onCreate. We can use this on our form action here. So all we have to do is do the word action equals and then onCreate and hit save. And now this is available to be used. So to test this out, what we can do here is just say console.log response.key. And we'll just hit save, and then we'll run npm run dev. And let's give this a try and see what happens. So now we have our project here. We can just type something in like hello key, hit create. We didn't get any errors. And then if we go into our console here, we have an object, and inside that object has a key and a key ID. And if we actually head over to Unkey, and we go back to the dashboard here, and we select the API that we had and go to keys, you can see if I sort these by created date, this is a user ID that's associated with the user, and this is the key. So now we have that. We know that this works, and we're associated with the user, and we have a name. What we should do is just allow the user to make a request. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just update our client component, and then we're going to create an API route that's separate from our application itself. And we're going to use that to verify that we can actually use this key. So here's what we can do. First, let's go to our client here. And what we're going to do is actually copy this card, and we're going to reuse this card. So all we need to do is take this key card here, like so, drop it down here, and we'll just say test API. And we can just say, for this part, we can get rid of all of the card content itself. And then the form action right now, we can delete 2. And we'll just hit save. So now we have this card and we can just say test API key, test your API key. Great. So now we have all of this and we're already setting the key up here. So we already have this set, so we can delete this out now. So this will be held in this function and we can use it. But what we need to do is create a route handler to actually handle this. So what we'll do is we'll create a folder inside of our app here. New folder, we'll call it API. And then inside of that, we'll create another folder called secret. And then inside of that, we'll just create a route.tss. So now this is where we're actually going to be doing some of the work. So first thing we're going to do is import verify key. Now verify key allows you to, as it sounds, verify your key and make sure that it is valid. And it's not rate limited or they haven't run out of uses or whatever you're using Unkey for. Then we need to import next response and we'll do that from next server. Then we can do export async function, get request, and then request like that. So this gives us the ability to essentially use our request here. We're going to use a get. What we're going to do now is say const header equals request headers get authorization. So we're going to get the authorization header here. If there's no header, so if there's no header here, then return new response. And we'll just do no auth header found. And we'll give it a status of 401. Technically, we should just not write that, but just for this demo purposes, so we understand how it works. So now we have that. Now we can do const token equals header dot replace bearer comma with an empty string. So essentially taking away the bearer part of the token. Then we can do const result. And this is the part that Unkey does, is result an error here. And then we can just do await verify key, and then we can toss in the token. As you can see here, we don't require the Unkey root key or API or anything like that. You can just verify against any key. And then all we need to do is do if there's an error, then we'll console log the error out. And then obviously we can return a new response. So we can just do this. And we'll just return a 500. And we'll just say something went wrong. Now inside of this error, Unkey gives you well-defined errors. So you'll be able to understand why there was an error. Then we can do if result dot valid. So if it's not valid, we can also do a return response here and say key not valid. And we'll give it a 401. And then finally, at that point, the only thing left to do is that it must be valid. So we can do return next response dot JSON, and then we can return the result. And that's it. So now we have this way of protecting this API route. And now all we need to do is quickly update this middleware. So inside of here, we can just add a public route. So just public routes. And then we'll do an array and we'll just say /API/secret in there. And then that will give us the ability to use API secret without having to be logged in. Right. So now we've made that really easy. You can make any business decision based upon that, right? So you can say if there's an error, well, that's just an error. But if it's not valid, you can return a response. Maybe you can handle that. Maybe you make them pay for remaining uses, or, you know, you just have your result. So now we just need to actually display this in a card or something to actually show the data that happens. So back to our component here in our client component, the one that we created that just has this test API key here. So we currently have this form, which we actually don't need anymore. So we can delete that out. And then we can just create the card content. And inside of this card content, all we're going to do is have a button that on click that gets the data, and that's going to make a fetch request to our route. Then we're just going to display it below for the user. So we can just do button on click equal to get data. Now that doesn't exist right now, but that's fine. We'll just say get data. Then underneath that button, we're going to just grab the input here. So this input right now, we're going to drop that right in here. And inside of this input, all we're going to do is say this label is secret data. Secret. And then all we're going to do is we're going to actually just set the value to equal JSON.stringify, and then we'll just put secret in here for now. Now we need to update two things because right now this get data doesn't exist, and of course the secret doesn't exist, but everything's here now to make this cool. So we can scroll back up. It's going to complain that get data doesn't exist, and that's okay. We're going to add another state here. We're going to say const secret set secret equal to use state, and we'll set that to another empty string here. Okay, so now we have a secret that we can use. Then underneath our onCreate here, we can do get data. So const get data equals async. So an asynchronous request. We're not going to put any arguments in. And all we're going to do is send the header. So what we can do is const res equals await fetch. And then in this example, it's going to be /API/secret, which is our route here. And then comma, inside of here is where we're actually going to put in our headers. So headers. And the only header we need is an authorization. So we do authorization. And then inside of the authorization header is where we're going to put our key. So we can just do bearer space $key. And then this response, all we're going to do from there is say const data equals await res.json. And then finally just set that secret to this key. And then we can just format this document real quick. We can get rid of this. Okay, so let's just talk about that one more time. So what we're doing here is saying, hey, we want to get the data that's a secret from this API, which is essentially just returning what comes back from Unkey. We're going to set the key to the bearer token, and then we're just going to request that, and then we're going to set it to this field right here. So if we go back to our application here, when we refresh, you can see we have this and this. So let's give this a name and say testing 1, 2, 3, create key. Now we know this works. So now if we click get data now, it should send the key from here and return the data. So if I click get data, you can see that I'm getting data back. Now if I go to like a JSON formatter, so we can actually see what's in here, and I type it in and then format that, you can see valid is true and the owner ID associated with that user has been returned as well. And then if we go and look for this key, it would be test 1, 2, 3. So if I refresh this page, you should see a name of test 1, 2, 3 and that user ID. So there's an overview of how to associate a user from your authentication provider with your Unkey API keys. Now, if you made it all the way to this video, please click right here, watch this video. It's algorithm driven, it'll be a banger. And of course, if you're not subscribed, click right here.